people we see in the shadows, if you look just a little bit under the surface, is corporate lobby groups.
These changes have come about through unprecedented levels of privileged access for corporations.
You're listening to EU Watchdog Radio.
Hi, welcome. I'm Joana, Comms Officer at Corporate Europe Observatory. EU Watchdog Radio is the podcast we host with Counterbalance. And today I will talk to my colleagues Kenneth, Haar and Tansey about two reports we published and which focus on different aspects of how close we are to losing hard-won victories in social, environmental, health and digital rights. We are at a tipping point. Under the guise of simplification, the European Commission has started an unprecedented deregulation frenzy of rules that will impact all of us, wherever we live, whatever we work on. At CEO, we have been involved in a wide coalition against it, and have been doing what we do best, researching and exposing what is happening behind the scenes. So, in this episode, Kenneth will talk about his recent report. This is what corporate capture looks like, how corporations run the EU deregulation agenda. And Rachel will discuss permission to pollute, EU rips up permitting rules, and funds dirty infrastructure. Let's go. Thank you very much, Kenneth. Can you let me know why you decided to write the report, This is what corporate capture looks like, and why did you decide to call it like that?
Sure. Well, at the moment, Brussels politics is about deregulation. So we see an immense effort by the institutions to roll back EU laws adopted to protect the public interest. Officially, it's about simplifying rules to avoid unnecessary bureaucracy. In reality, it's about rolling back decisions taken within the last couple of years to protect the public interest. So there are attacks on rules to protect the environment. There are attempts to undermine climate policies. They go back on promises to regulate big tech, and the list goes on. So an obvious question to ask is, where does this all come from? Who are calling the shot, and who is pointing the institutions, the Commission in particular, to go for the European laws that we now see changed. So that's in a nutshell is what the report is about. It's about figuring out how the list of laws they want to change is done, and how the specific ideas for changes emerge. And the title, This is what corporate capture looks like, indicates the results of the report, basically. That the people we see in the shadows, if you look just a little bit under the surface, is corporate lobby groups. They work closely with the Commission to develop this simplification or this deregulation agenda.
One specific aspect of this deregulation, as our climate team found out, is about permitting. Over to Rachel.
Basically, we were digging into industry lobbying in lots of different areas relating to climate, energy, industrial policy, and so on, by doing loads of access to documents requests. And when we were analysing these hundreds of documents that we got back, and yes, that did require a lot of coffee, it quickly became clear that a lot of the companies in lots of different sectors were asking for the same thing, for the EU to rip up its rules on permitting for their polluting projects. So permits sound like a pretty dry topic, at least to me, but they're actually one of the most concrete ways that communities around Europe are protected from the worst behaviour of big business. EU permitting laws require companies to assess things like the impacts that their projects will have, whether it's a mine, a pipeline, a factory or an airport, the impacts that they'll have on our drinking water, on wildlife and natural habitats, on the people who live close by, and also to consult those people who are affected by this project. So ripping apart these rules by weakening and providing widespread new exemptions to them, or in EU parlance by simplifying them, in practice, what that means is slashing hard-won social and environmental protections that underpin those permitting rules. So when we saw that these rules were under attack, we thought that this is a topic, how the EU is giving industry permission to pollute at the request of some of its most polluting companies, is a topic that we should expose and fight back on.
Back to Kenneth and to this is what corporate capture looks like. And it's obviously also a pun with the slogan, this is what democracy looks like, when right now we're seeing far from democracy in action.
Exactly. It's quite the opposite.
Yeah. And can you briefly describe the results that you got in your study?
We had a pretty good idea what we would find, and we were not very surprised. The deregulation agenda is developed in close cooperation between the European Commission and business organizations, most of them from the corporate lobbying community. So the report has statistics that show how most commissioners talk almost exclusively to businesses about what they should do to improve, so to speak, European laws. For instance, in last year, in 2025, the commissioners involved in the simplification work, 84% of their meetings were with business groups. If you zoom in on perhaps the most important commissioner, the one who is responsible for the overall deregulation campaign, Dombrovskis is his name. He had 184 meetings with external actors, and 182 of them were with business groups.
If this number is not shocking enough, and you're more of a percentage kind of person, 182 out of 184 meetings is 98.9%. But that's not all.
If you look at the industry commissioner, the French Joana, he had 84 meetings about deregulation, and they were all with business groups. So already there you get an indication of how this works. The Commission has set up a whole complex system of dialogues with business groups to make sure that businesses are able to provide input and help the Commission develop their plans.
And among these dialogues, these moments when the Commission can hear industry, there are two specific ones that have very interesting sounding names. If it were a fiction, they could not have come up with better names, which are implementation dialogues and reality checks. So what are they? What are those kind of meetings, and how far have they been dominated by corporate interests?
Yeah, they are. I mean, they are both. They are two types of meetings that have been invented, so to speak, to establish a system of dialogues between mainly business groups and the Commission about the simplification agenda. So it's the explicit purpose of implementation dialogues and reality checks are to help the Commission figure out where to go next, what laws to change next. And they're broadly similar in structure, except that the reality checks are practically happening under the radar, so they're much less transparent than the implementation dialogues. And it's not that, I mean, sometimes you do come across meetings where you would have a few representatives from trade unions or from civil society, but broadly speaking, they are all dominated by business groups. So they live fully up to the plan, to the strategy, to the expectations. You could say that this is to provide a channel for business groups to influence the Commission on the deregulation agenda.
Back to Rachel, it is interesting that, like she said, so many different things are included in this permitting umbrella, which, again, like she says, does sound dry, but it has very concrete consequences for people. So what then were the main results of the report?
We've seen that since the start of the second von der Leyen Commission, the European Commission, these permitting rules have been under attack from big tech, big oil, mining and metals lobbies, chemicals groups and big business clubs. And And that they've been making demands to kind of rip these rules up, often at the invitation of the Commission, which has opened its arms almost exclusively to industry to input on this topic, at the expense of trade unions, public health groups, indigenous communities, environmental groups, and so on. And some of the key industry demands that we're seeing being delivered include fast-tracked, sped-up permitting for industrial energy infrastructure that sidelines democratic participation, for example, of the communities affected, which can curtail their rights. We're seeing simpler, quicker environmental assessments being allowed, sometimes none at all, which means less protection for our water, soil, air, wildlife, birds, natural habitats, again, really far-reaching. More dirty projects are getting classed as strategic or in the public interest, which means they're getting special treatment in permitting processes, their interest elevated above environmental or social concerns. That's going to result in human health being endangered by deadly pollutants in our water, soils, as you see things like mines and pipelines and factories getting exemptions from these rules. We've also seen water protection and nature protection laws opened up to be weakened, which brings further threats to things like biodiversity. I'd like to point out that these changes aren't all happening in one place, but through changes to existing laws, through new strategies and new proposed laws with more on the way, and the application of these statuses like being strategic, being in the public interest, through existing instruments, and that the application of those labels to more polluting and problematic industrial projects. The second big thing is that these changes, weakening permitting rules, have come about through unprecedented levels of privileged access for corporations. This attack on permitting is part of a bigger, broader push to deregulate at the European level that's happening at the request of industry. What we saw is that on top of existing channels of influence, like directly lobbying the Commission and dominating that lobbying, other things like advisory forums that privilege industry's views and industrial alliances, this has also been fed into through new channels of influence designed to put corporate interests first, from more closed-door workshops with industry to these new skewed consultations like reality checks and implementation dialogues.
And these are the same implementation dialogues and reality checks that Kenneth was speaking about.
What's more, we also see that companies aren't just using these channels of influence to push the Commission to fast-track polluting projects by ripping up permitting rules. They're also pushing for public subsidies to build them. And again, the Commission is saying yes, through new mechanisms that allow public money to be used to pay for private companies' risks. Well, guess what? They still take the profits. That means we're not just going to be living with more pollution, we're actually going to be paying the polluters for the privilege.
Yeah, that's really shocking. The fact that, what you just said, that we're not only allowing them, we're actually spending public money financing those. By the way, I was
things.
Not recording this podcast in a war zone. This is the sound of what seem to be never-ending works in the streets of Brussels. And Kenneth also had something to add about the tool the Commission is using to cause these changes with what is really uncharacteristic speed.
The Commission and many governments as well, and certainly lots of corporate lobby groups, are very eager to do this in a very quick manner, to be very fast about changing European laws. They manage to do it speedily in various ways. One of them is to produce their proposals in the form of omnibus laws. And omnibuses is about changing several European laws in one go. So, for instance, on chemicals, when the Commission sets out to change the rules on chemicals, they don't just go for one law at a time. They put 3 or 4 laws together and change them in one go. So that's basically what omnibuses are about. And last year in 2025, they presented 10 different omnibus laws, and I think by judging by what's going on at the moment, we will see more or less the same number this year.
There were 3 specific case studies that you worked on in the report, because again, such a broad topic, it was relevant to find specific examples of what was going on. So can you talk us through them?
Yeah, so we had 3 case studies, all quite different, but they're looking at the risks that come from gutting EU permitting rules. So we had one on data centres. Specifically, we looked at this huge data centre build-out that's been happening in Ireland. So part of this kind of AI boom, data centres consume vast amounts of electricity. In Dublin, half of Dublin's electricity demand, which pushes up prices and also has prevented households actually getting power. They also mean households actually pay far more for electricity than these big tech companies. As we're also seeing that companies operating data centres are building new dirty energy, new gas power plants on site to power their data centres, which is having terrible climate impacts. And we're seeing that big tech has been targeting EU permitting rules that could be a barrier for new developments, but also rules that provide a legal recourse for communities on the ground who are fighting these projects. And you know, they have these kind of existing EU rules that they can use in the courts.
The second case study was about CO2, carbon dioxide, pipelines.
The EU's plans to keep using fossil fuels rely on the idea that we can capture CO2 from polluting installations and from fossil fuel use and transport it through pipelines. They want to build 19,000 kilometres of them to places where they can store them. Now, there's huge problems with this technology. It's been failing for decades. Nonetheless, what hasn't been paid a lot of attention is how dangerous the CO2 pipelines themselves are. So in the US, where we have more of these pipelines, there have been accidents that see clouds of CO2 spreading very rapidly, which CO2 is a gas that suffocates you, and it can injure or kill. In the US, in places where these pipelines are, the population density is far, far lower than in Europe. And, we're seeing plans from, for example, Germany to put these pipelines through densely populated areas, in Italy, through areas that are flood and earthquake prone, and through areas that also should be protected as they have kind of EU nature protection status. But again, because the projects, these CO2 pipelines, are given a public interest label, they're getting permission anyway. And we're also seeing that it's really the fossil fuel industry, big oil lobby groups who've been shaping the new loopholes to permitting rules so that CO2 pipelines can be built, because this is an escape hatch for the fossil fuel industry to keep operating. And we've got a new EU law coming later this year that's expected to really ease permitting even further for these pipelines.
The last case study Rachel worked on is about a new critical raw materials mine and iron ore mine in northern Sweden. It is run by a Swedish company called LKAB, and it threatens to destroy a millennia-old way of life of the indigenous Sami people.
They're reindeer herders, and the mine will cut off the last seasonal migration route for the reindeer herds. And the practices of this indigenous group also help protect the Arctic from climate change. Yet we've seen that this mine called Purgasia has won fast-track permits through, again, an EU-designated strategic status. You've seen that LKAB, together with a EU lobby group called Euromines, of which it's, by the way, the boss of, has been pushing for fast-track permitting for mining. And it's also, Euromines has also teamed up with the fossil fuel industry and other polluting industries to create an informal permitting coalition, which is demanding even more widespread EU deregulation of permitting rules.
We are almost at the end of this episode, but before we go, I'll just take 1 minute of your time. In an increasingly challenging and complex world, it is our hope that our work at CEO, our analysis and research, makes a vital contribution. So we wanted to reach out to you today with a very direct request. Our deep dive investigations of who is shaping policy and in whose interests, and the work of democratic scrutiny, coalition building, and sustaining an informed and active public all take huge amounts of work and resources behind the scenes. We are a very small independent group in an ever more hostile political environment, and we rely on the contributions of those of you who voluntarily choose to support us financially. Our research is freely accessible and always will be. But if you can chip in with a contribution, it would help us immeasurably. In short, if you find what we do at all valuable, please take the next step and donate today. Every amount helps. Visit our website or go to corporateeurope.org/support-CEO. Thank you. Back to Kenneth and Rachel.
And then, finally, if someone hears this conversation, reads your report, and wants to get involved in because people are fighting against deregulation. This is the good news. So
Yes.
if someone wants to get involved in the fight against deregulation, what can they do?
Yeah, but that it depends on who you are and where you are, of course. I mean, at the moment, we need a lot of organizations to be involved in campaigns in the European institutions to roll this whole agenda back. And we have a growing network of organizations called the Rules to Protect Network, which I believe is a brilliant vehicle for the fight against this whole agenda. But I think, I mean, it's important to say as well that this is something that functions at a lot of levels. Often there are things you can do locally too. If the Commission, for instance, sets out to protect dangerous pesticides, there are things you can do locally to act against it. Have your politicians speak out, have them reject the European agenda, and have your politicians make decisions that ban those pesticides, even if Brussels says otherwise.
Yeah, so we're seeing across the continent, people are resisting this sort of chainsaw that's been taken to our laws, like permitting rules, that protect our rights and our health and our ecosystems. So you can check out the Hands Off Nature petition. This shows already hundreds of thousands of people calling on the EU not to sacrifice public health to short-term private profit-making or to trade the protection of nature for greater exposure to harm. But I think it's important to say that for this to happen, we need to end EU decision-makers' cosy relationship with big polluters. As long as they're the ones whispering in policymakers' ears, we're not going to get a truly just transition to cleaner, safer jobs. So increasingly groups like Fossil Free Politics are making their voices heard, and you can join up with them and join in other fights to get big tech out of our politics and get toxic chemical lobbies away from influencing policymakers. Finally, I think if you're coming from a community that has had to or is having to fight badly planned, destructive or polluting new infrastructure, you need to take note of what's happening at the European level, because without EU permitting rules, which are far from perfect, we also lose that recourse to EU law and the courts when they're not followed, and that will make these fights harder and also more common. So that's why, we need to fight for these rules that actually do help to protect our rights and our environment, and resist this really illogical idea that competitiveness for big business is a reason to destroy rights and protections that have been hard won over many decades, let alone the fact that cutting costs for companies by wrecking people's health, livelihoods, poisoning water, soils, air, that puts far greater costs onto society, onto the public purse, and of course onto future generations. So I think the main things are get your voice heard, get informed, join up with these groups who are fighting the dominance of polluters' voices over politics and fighting this narrative that for the sake of competitiveness, we should just trample all over our rights.
Sure. And there are also coalitions similar to the Rules to Protect that is operating at the EU level, at Brussels level, but in the different member states. And I know that you were recently in Germany at the launch of one such coalition.
That's
but
right.
there are more.
I think there, and that's a very encouraging sign that we've seen coalitions in several countries, in Austria, in Germany, in France and elsewhere, pop up organizations that come together at the national level to work together against the deregulation agenda, and I think definitely that's the way forward. This is not something that organizations based in Brussels, such as Corporate Europe Observatory, can manage on our own. Definitely not. It is something that will require a major effort from a lot of people across Europe. And one of the promising signs is these national coalitions that we see coming up.
Yes.
We have come to the end
Thank
of
you
this
so much.
podcast. If you like it, make sure you also listen to the previous episodes, where our friends at Counterbalance discuss how public investment is fueling the arms race. Till next time, beijinhos!